Hey neighbor, welcome to the death of a genre. Join me as we lay flowers at the grave of some once popular styles of music on this episode of 7 on Sunday. Musical genres have been defining cultural landmarks as we look back to the past to remember where we came from, what spearheaded a shift in consumption, and what rose from the ashes to replace it. From the very moment a movement begins, the clock starts ticking. Granted, some batteries last longer than others, but even the Energizer Bunny goes into hibernation. People are just fickle, and genres get overexposed. That can force the style back into the underground scene, where maybe they thrive, or maybe they die, depending on how you see your glass of water. Do me a solid and hit that like button, subscribe if you're new in town, and now, let's explore the downfalls and disappearances of 7 genres.
Round and round, we'll love will find a way, just give it time.
Hair metal was an unstoppable, borderline hilarious force in the 1980s. Combining outrageous outfits with skyscraper locks, bands like Motley Crue, Ratt, Def Leppard, and Cinderella kicked the door in on any expectation that the 80s would just be business as usual. In fact, the 80s are one of my least favorite decades in music. This specific style here really grinds my gears with how it seemed to value looks over quality, which does make sense, I guess, given the nickname. With albums of this nature routinely destroying charts and selling millions of records and tickets to their insane live shows, hair metal's downfall in the late 80s after the release of the debut Guns N' Roses album is something we probably saw coming from a mile away, much like the clouds of hairspray needed to achieve those looks. The last hair metal hurrah is often considered to be Dr. Feelgood, the 6th album by Motley Crue. Sales were huge, but the end was nigh, as a little subgenre known as grunge grew so large, hair metal was all but extinct by the early 90s. Hair metal was as reckless as the decade that birthed it, and despite the fact that I do have a lot of criticisms of the genre, there are plenty of songs that I do enjoy, from the horns up anthems to the hammed up ballads and their glorious key changes that proved even the bad boys would let down their hair when the mood came knock knock knockin'. In response to the gritty darkness that dominated much of the early 90s music scene in the UK, Britpop emerged as a witty but fun counterculture that sported brighter melodies, prominent guitars, and catchy hooks that celebrated being British instead of trying to Americanize it. Media frenzies are largely responsible for just how big Britpop became, as they promoted the intense chart battles between Blur and Oasis, which only amplified fans' desire to see the magic live in concert. Festival performances from those big names, plus the likes of The Verve and Elastica, drew crowds in excess of 100,000. Huge attendance, astronomical sales, a culture that celebrated lads being lads, but somehow everything fizzled out as the peak years lasted from just 1993 to 1997. 2 major releases signaled that the general public was getting sick of this sound. Oasis's Be Here Now and The Verve's Urban Hymns both dropped in 1997, and while people were buzzing at the time, Be Here Now in particular wore out its welcome fast as audiences turned their heads elsewhere. There's nothing more 90s than the original Britpop armada, so expect some intense pangs of nostalgia if you decide to queue up Park Life or Dogman Star. It's not always mind-blowing, but it's still an unmistakable reminder that music from the United Kingdom stands in a league of its own.
Nothing can stop me now, 'cause I'm the Duke of air.
Contrary to what some out-of-the-loop listeners in the modern age might think, Doo-Wops is more than an album title for Bruno Mars and definitely wasn't invented by the horror show known as Meghan Trainor. Actually, doo-wop rose to prominence in black culture during the 1950s, with many vocal groups adding those signature backing doo-woppy harmonies to make the genre stand out and break the soul genre tag that was often given to black artists, even if their music they were making didn't fit. Doo-wop is far from being a favorite genre of mine, but listening to classics like Blue Moon by the Marcells, Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings, and Speedoo by the Cadillacs never fail to make me wonder what it would have been like to experience the hits in their heyday. While the genre started to fizzle out in the 60s, it wasn't without its fans, as many dancing clubs continued to embrace doo-wop, as did certain rock bands who routinely blended elements of blues, soul, and doo-wop into their music as late as the 1970s. Various comebacks have been attempted, as it's a pretty widely known style. I wouldn't say that any of those have been super long lasting, but that's more than fine. The golden oldies are still preserved, even if the movement itself seems to have been lost in time. Earlier we talked about the fall of hair metal, so it's only appropriate to talk about how grunge killed the glam star quicker than you can say Smells Like Teen Spirit. Grunge was a tag generally applied to Seattle bands signed to indie label Sub Pop Records in the late 80s and early 90s. It was reserved for bands who played a very sludgy, distorted take on punk and metal, along with lyrics that typically spilled on subjects of angst, alienation, self-expression, and more. The transformation from underground niche to mainstream success is unlike anything I've ever seen. Grunge artists were in constant rotation on MTV and the radio, and albums from Nirvana, Stone Temple Pilots, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains sold millions upon millions of copies in a short amount of time, with 1991 to 1994 usually listed as the commercial peak. Humanity loves a good gold rush, and grunge looked like a fat stack of cash to label heads especially stateside, who were throwing contracts at anyone with a distorted guitar tone and a flannel shirt. Fashion was an undeniable part of grunge, with its followers adhering to the strict don't care about what you wear mantra that embraced the comfort of everyday clothes you could wear at home or on stage, which was in direct contrast to how over the top and downright dumb hair metal had become.
Special report on a very sad day. Kurt Cobain, the leader of one of rock's most gifted and promising bands, Nirvana, is dead, and this is the story as we know it so far.
April 5th, 1994. Kurt Cobain, frontman of Nirvana and unintentional poster boy for grunge, dead by suicide at age 27. This was the catalyst for the death of an entire genre that had seemingly just begun. But within a few short years of Kurt dying, popular acts from Bush to STP had either dialed back or diverted their style away from grunge, as many of the less successful clones quickly broke up. Grunge rapidly disappeared from the charts as mid-90s America couldn't decide what the hell they wanted to listen to, but much like the dead stars we see in the sky at night, sometimes it's better to burn out than to fade away. When people think of a certain style of music, they typically think of when it broke out in the mainstream, but fail to understand that these things don't just pop off out of nowhere. It's a steady laying of the train tracks until it takes off, which is exactly what happened with Crunk. Crunk was an instantly recognizable subgenre of rap that pulled mostly from southern hip-hop and gangster rap, but with a high-tempo twist. Lil Jon is the perfect example, given that he's the king of crunk himself, and in his music you hear the shouted vocals and no fucks given attitude stirred in with buzzing synth keys, big brass drum machines, and a whole lot of noise. This wasn't a flash-in-the-pan, get-rich-quick then pull-the-rug story either. It was a grassroots movement established throughout the 90s before finally getting that massive push by the early 2000s as the word crunk became synonymous for southern hip-hop, even though the genre tag itself meant full of energy or get hyped. This was music for clubs, nights out, parties, your super sweet 16, you name it, crunk is by your side. As was your crunk juice, of course. All hail Lil Jon's pimp cup.
Shut up, biatch!
The outlandish, tacky style with extra dirty lyrics lost its shock value after a while, and if there's anything that I learned from living through that crazy decade, it's that we must have been smoking something strong, because pretty much any genre could have taken off at that time. You've probably heard either me or another creator say umbrella to describe something, and nowhere is that more appropriate than the umbrella that was needed to describe the terms that fell under new wave music that absolutely swallowed the early 80s whole. Punk rock in the 70s was a major deviation from the norms of pop, rock, and early metal. So when genres such as post-punk started evolving beyond that one label, we needed a blanket term for the steadily growing movements behind synth-pop, punk, electronic, art rock, prog, glam, and so many more. Many people see new wave as a meaningless adjective that's applied to any 80s band with an audible synth line rather than an actual genre. Duran Duran, The Cars, Talking Heads, Echo and the Bunnymen. There's a rich history there worth exploring on your own. It's hard to deny that the ship had lost its steam by the late 80s, as the media beat the term like a dead horse, and bands started moving away from the sounds that defined an entire decade. For someone like me, who sees the 1980s music scene as a headache sometimes, new wave and the many subgenres behind it are easily among the best that era had to offer. How in the name of Skrillex did we let this happen? Dubstep is dead. in the mainstream, but for about 2 years in the early 2010s, those of us who wake up and choose chaos were eating 5-course meals cooked up by whatever mad scientist was dropping the beat.
Working on a couple new beats. This one's pretty good, but this one is sick. Turn up.
Dubstep originated not in America, but as with many things, across the pond in the UK. Several BBC radio DJs began playing dubstep artists and promoting the sound, but it wasn't until the tail end of the aughts that the rest of the world started catching on. Something about the constant suspense of the gargantuan energy to come was pure unfiltered chaos in the best way. Blasting beats, melodic vocals, sampling multiple ever-changing drops, the genre was evolving into the mainstream so fast that you'd blink and another DJ was teaming up with Rihanna or Florence Welch, and even rock bands like Muse. Primarily between 2010 to 2014, the year that Skrillex released his long-awaited debut full-length album Recess, dubstep thrived hand in hand with the dance club craze that was very much still booming. However, this changed as both indie, trap, and more chill EDM stuff began dominating the charts, as music embraced the minimalism of artists like Lorde, instead of this over-the-top BPM machine that grew artists like Bass Nectar, Skrillex, Skream, and Zomboy. This was never built to last. It grew too tall, too fast before it had proper legs to stand on, so both the change in what the masses wanted in their music, along with the lack of support from popular artists, meant an all but fatal collapse that put the genre back in its grave underground, where most fans of dubstep would actually probably prefer it to stay as it returned to its true home. This is an incomplete list since many other genres have died out in popularity. What should I put on it if I do a part 2? Let me know in the comments down below, hit the like button while you're down there, and maybe subscribe if you haven't already. You can catch up with more SOS by clicking the links on screen, and I'll return soon with more on ARTV.